This morning, our speaker is Pete Soderman, and he'll explain how we can take advantage of neuroplasticity to mitigate the effects of aging and make fundamental changes in our lives. Neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain and nervous system to change structurally and functionally as a result of input from the environment. Pete is a teacher, a student, a writer, and a participant in bringing about the computer revolution. So please welcome Pete Soderman.
Hi, is this going to work? I guess it is. Very good. Good morning. My name is Pete Soderman. I'll be your speaker this morning. I'd like to welcome you all to Open Circle. For those of you that are new here today or this week, welcome. You have not as yet enjoyed our typical weather. Believe me, the last 2 or 3 weeks has been rather atypical. And it's nice to see that at least we can have this outside today. This is my first time speaking at Open Circle. If I'm a little nervous, I hope you'll give me a little bit of slack. I don't have anything to sell you this morning, nothing for you to sign up for. I don't have any books to autograph, although I'm writing one. I just sit back, relax, enjoy it, and hopefully we'll have a little fun. What I'm going to talk about this morning is neuroplasticity, which is a big word, a rather simple concept actually, and brain structure, the learning process. Primarily that's what I'm going to focus on, and how we can change our behaviors as a result of what we know about neuroplasticity and how the brain works. And we're going to finish up talking about neurogenesis, which is the creation of new neurons. We all grow new neurons all the time, regardless of what we do. We can't help it. It's something the body just does. What we do have control over, however, is how many we can grow and what we can do with them once they're there, because neurons are simply, as I'll explain, a use it or lose it proposition. If you don't use them, they wither and die. Why am I up here this morning? I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a neurologist. I'm a computer engineer by trade. Been in the business a long, long time. I'm just an ordinary guy who was willing to do a great deal of research into an area in which I have a vested interest. I am an ex-addict, a recovered addict, whatever term you care to use. I had a using career that began when I was 18 and ended in 1990. About 6-7 years ago, I became curious about addiction. I was working with some addicts and started wondering why they behaved as they did. Why does this disorder make us act as we do? Why is it so hard for some people to get over it? So I did some research, not into the popular books and whatever. I started looking into scientific research. I mean, it's available to just about anyone. All you have to do is learn the language a little bit, and you can pretty much follow along. When I started into this research, I discovered a couple of things that kind of blew me away, because I wasn't expecting to learn either one. First thing I found out was that an overwhelming percentage of addicts recover on their own or with a minimum of outside help. They don't show up in treatment centers or hospitals or recovery groups or anywhere else. They simply recover on their own or with a little bit of help. And these are addicts who meet, or in some cases exceeded, the guideline or the criteria of the American Psychiatric Association for substance abuse and substance dependence. The second thing I found that blew me away was that according to the research community and according to the research that has been done, addiction is a biopsychosocial disorder. It's not a spiritual malady that addicts are powerless over at all. If it was, the huge percentage that recover on their own, and it's about 3 out of 4, by the way, wouldn't be able to do that. At that point, I kind of focused my research into, well, these people who recover on their own, how do they do that? Have there been studies? Has there been research into how they do it? And indeed, there has been. What are the things that work? What are the things that don't work so well? How do most people recover? And are there some techniques that will help them to recover? And it turns out that a large part of what we call addiction is learned behavior. Okay, we learn to become addicts. Yes, there are physical and chemical changes that take place in the brain, and many of those we can do nothing about. They're irreversible. However, what we can do something about is the part of addiction that's learned. And that's the direction my research took, and that's what I'm going to talk about primarily this morning. I'm not going to talk about addiction hardly at all. That's another talk for perhaps another time when my book's ready. I'm writing a book called Powerless No Longer, which looks at addiction from the standpoint of neurophysiology and neuroplasticity. If you talk to a neuroscientist 20, 25 years ago, what he would tell you is that beyond a certain point of during adolescence, the brain is pretty much fixed and immutable. New neurons weren't added, the brain couldn't change its structure. What you had was pretty much what you had. If you went out and killed brain cells, somehow they were dead, gone, those functions were gone, and so on. In 1990, an interesting research tool called the fMRI, Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging System, was discovered. It's primarily a research tool, and it's like an MRI in that it images inside the body, but what it images, instead of organs and looking for different things that are wrong, it images blood flow. It shows neuroscientists what areas of the brain are active due to certain stimuli. What's growing, what's not growing, what areas are turned on by what, and so on. And what they found was, as was already read, experience can change the brain's physical structure and functional organization from top to bottom. That's called neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is a big word, which essentially means you can change your mind. And that's basically what it means. It's responsible for not only for our learning and unlearning, it's also responsible for the ability of some people to recover from serious injuries, strokes, and diseases that will or disrupt some of their brain functions. We all know of people or have heard of people who have lost one of their senses, their eyesight, for instance, and a few months later find that they've developed more acuity in their sense of touch and their sense of hearing, etc. This is nothing but one area of the brain taking over an area of the brain that isn't used anymore, or is used very little. We also are aware of people who've lost, they had a stroke on the right side of your head, which controls the left side of your body, so you lose movement, you lose your sense of touch through therapy, and in many cases a lot of hard work. People can overcome this, and what's happening is, and we know this from imaging, is that other areas of the brain are taking over these functions from the area of the brain that was lost. We're all born with roughly 100 billion nerve cells called neurons. Most of these are located in our heads. There are a huge number, however, scattered throughout the body, and they're there for a couple of purposes. They are the brain's sensory network. The neurons in our body send impulses to the brain for pain, for touch, for other things, and they're also carrying information the other way for muscle control. Our muscles are controlled by our brains through neurons. Neurons have three parts. The center of the neuron is called the soma, S-O-M-A. It contains the nucleus of the cell and also all the little organelles that make a cell go. The input to the neuron is called the dendrite. Think of that tree, very broad at the base, tapers very rapidly. Dendrites are typically very short as inputs to the neuron, maybe a millimeter or so in length. The output side of the neuron, however, is called the axon, A-X-O-N. It's like an oil pipeline, okay? It can be as short as a millimeter, or as long as a meter, or even longer. These, again, if they're in the body, they carry inputs and outputs in both directions, to and from the brain, to control muscles and register pain. Each neuron connects to between a few thousand and as many as 100,000 other neurons. The point of connection, the point where the dendrite connects to the axon, for instance, is called a synapse. And I know you've all heard that word. A synapse is nothing but a gap, a millionth of a centimeter wide. Through those tiny gaps flow all of our thoughts, emotions, and sensory perceptions. The agents, I'll call them agents right now, that actually carry the information from one side of the synapse to the other are called neurotransmitters. And there's a whole bunch of them. And most of them are relevant for our discussion today. Two of them are dopamine and serotonin. There's GABA. There's a bunch of them. It's not important what they are. They're generated by the neuron, and they actually carry impulse. They carry information from one side of the synapse to the other. The neurons are fired by a difference in electrical potential. Information coming into the dendrite causes this. If it causes that neuron to fire, it allows transmission across the synaptic gap on the output side, and that's how information moves through the brain. In the adult brain, the total number of these connections, or synapses, are somewhere, for most of us, between, let's say, 500 trillion and 1,000 trillion. 1,000 trillion synaptic connections. are possible. Synapses that are not used are pruned away. As I think I mentioned, neurons and synapses are a use it or lose it proposition. If you don't use a particular connection, it withers and dies. The brain is very efficient that way. There's only so much blood, there's only so much nourishment, so it's only going to nourish and support the circuits that we're using. By one estimate, we lose about 20 billion a day. Sounds like a lot, but it's not a lot when you're looking at the possibility of 100, or rather 1,000 trillion. One more concept, and I'll get off of neurons, and that's the issue of synaptic strength. And it's really key to understanding neuroplasticity. When two connected neurons are simultaneously active a good deal of the time, the synapse itself changes in such a way that makes the activation of one cell more likely to cause the other cell to fire. What happens here chemically is beyond the scope of this talk, but just understand that cells that fire together wire together. A good analogy for that is a dirt road in the country. We had deep ruts worn by generations of wagon traffic. That's the concept of synaptic strength. The more we use a particular neural net, the stronger it becomes. So how do we learn? Because that's the only area of the brain I'm going to go into. I'm not going to talk about how we compute things and all that stuff. The learning process. The first step in memory formation is called encoding. It's a biological process rooted in the senses, and it begins with perception. Think about meeting your first crush, okay? You had visual perceptions, their appearance, their smile, their eye color, the tilt of their head. You had auditory perceptions, the sound of their laughter, the sound of their voice. You had the smell of perfume or aftershave. And you may have felt the touch of their hand when it brushed against your arm. These different perceptions traveled along neural pathways from different regions of your brain to a portion of your brain called the hippocampus. In the hippocampus, they were integrated as they occurred and became one single experience. Your experience of that particular person. Imaging studies indicate that the hippocampus, along with another part of the brain called the frontal cortex, is responsible for analyzing all of these various sensory inputs and deciding whether or not they're worth remembering. New information, what you're hearing right now, is going into your short-term memory. If we decide that the information or experience is particularly important, or it's repeated a number of times, or if we're really paying attention, it may become part of our long-term memories. We forge long-term memories and learn new habits and skills by strengthening neural connections. This happens primarily through repetition, trauma, or reward. If we perform a task or recall some information that causes groups of connected neurons to fire in concert, it strengthens the connections between these neurons, and they become what we call declarative memory. That's the first step beyond short-term memory. Declarative memory is the memory that we use for conscious decision-making. Okay? When we're doing our checkbooks or deciding what restaurant to eat at, or we remember the way home, so on and so forth. These are items in our declarative memory, conscious decision-making. If we strengthen them enough, these pathways turn into what we call working or habit memory. We can, at that point, recall information or perform certain tasks without the intervention or collaboration of our conscious mind. That's what we call habit. Practice makes permanent. The more times a network is stimulated, the stronger and more efficient it becomes. And I keep repeating that in different ways because it's the most important concept that I really have this morning. An analogy for habit memory would be something like, arguably the hardest thing to do in all of sports is hit a major league pitcher. Well, a 300 hitter doesn't get up there and start thinking about what muscles he's going to contract, in what order and to what degree to hit the pitch that's coming. No, he has about a millisecond to make up his mind, and well-developed neural pathways do the rest. And it's the same thing with a concert pianist. He doesn't think, or she doesn't think about her finger movements when she's playing a piece she's practiced her whole life. She sits down and does it. That's habit memory. We open the refrigerator when we're hungry. Many recent studies show that another tool called mindfulness can also lead quickly to the formation of declarative or habit memory. Simply paying attention and being present to our lives is what I'm talking about. Chopping wood when you're chopping wood, doing the dishes when you're doing dishes, paying attention. And how you train yourself to do that, there's many different ways to do that. But the point is, if we learn to do that, pay attention, perhaps we can remember where we put our car keys the night before. If we have a new experience or hear novel information, neuroplasticity allows either an alteration to the structure of already existing connections between neurons or forms brand new connections. Either way, the brain is remolded to take in the new data and, if useful, retain it. Certain events can imprint permanent memories simply by their magnitude and the effects they have on our lives and on our emotions. You were alive in Pearl Harbor, the Kennedy assassination, 9/11. You pretty much know where you were when you heard that, and those events are pretty much burned into your permanent memory. Few of us, however, can remember where we were, or what we did the day before, unless it was equally as traumatic. Now we have the reward-driven learning process. We reproduce, we defend ourselves, we protect our young, and perform other important functions that are key to our survival and the survival of our species. This area of human behavior is controlled by a portion of the brain that Dave talked about a couple of weeks ago. The primitive area of our brain, the reptile brain, if you prefer. It's the center of what neurologists call the reward pathway, also referred to as the limbic system. It organizes the behaviors that are life-sustaining, provides some tools necessary to take the desired actions, and rewards us with pleasure when we do. It's triggered by any pleasurable activity. Okay, everything from a chocolate chip cookie to sex to anything else that we enjoy. The information, the circumstances are encoded. The circumstances that led to the pleasure are encoded so that we can repeat the behavior and repeat the reward. A critical component of the system is a neurotransmitter called dopamine. I'm not going to go any deeper into it than that. It's released from neurons in our reward system circuits, and it functions as a neurotransmitter. It heightens our awareness and focuses our attention. Think about losing a child in the mall, okay? It just, your attention was diverted for just a second by a clerk or whatever, the kid runs off, and you panic, okay? Your body goes into, or your brain goes into a pattern matching mode. You're afraid for your child. You rush out into the mall, and a glimpse of a wisp of hair, a tilt of a head, a tiny corner of a cap seen 50 yards away, and you know that's your kid. Okay? That's pattern matching. That's driven by the chemicals in the brain that are released by the limbic system that's responsible for a lot of our very basic activities. Unfortunately, well, there's no system that'll drive the formation of new connections or strengthen existing ones faster than the limbic system. And unfortunately, it's the system that's hijacked by addiction. Okay, that's the part of the brain and the learning mechanism of addiction. It starts with a pleasurable experience, and it's repeated in certain people for certain reasons beyond the scope of this discussion. But that's the system that's hijacked by addiction. The executive center of the brain provides motivation, rationalization, and the activities of other brain areas necessary to repeat the pleasurable experience. The keys there are motivation and rationalization. We can rationalize that piece of chocolate cake, and we can rationalize that chocolate chip cookie. That is, I wouldn't trivialize addiction to say that it's like that, but it's that same kind of thing. It's that rationalization that goes on. It's very, very difficult, very, very difficult to overcome. So how do we change our behaviors? Assuming that we've formed habits that we don't like, and they could be anything. They could be something that we do that annoys our spouse. It could be something we do that annoys the person that employs us. It doesn't matter what it is. But let's say we have habits that we want to change. First of all, the brain is a one-way street. As I mentioned, we prune 20 billion synapses a day in areas of the brain that aren't used. We forget people, places, and things. We lose skills, some of which we acquire with a great deal of effort. We change habits. We change our likes, dislikes, political parties. We adapt new ways of doing things, discarding the old. In other words, if we are, in fact, the sum of our experiences, we become different people over time. It's all the result of neuroplasticity. I'm a different man than I was 20 years ago. Totally different. I've changed almost everything there is to change about myself. Okay? Many of you have. I'm not claiming any sort of uniqueness here. We all change in minor ways, in major ways. All I'm trying to do this morning is perhaps give you a clue to how you can focus that and do that wanting to do it. Major league ball players take batting practice every day. Actors rehearse and rehearse and rehearse. Jascha Heifetz, the renowned violinist, is rumored to have said, if I don't practice for one day, I know it. If I don't practice for 2 days, the critics know it. If I don't practice for 3 days, the audience knows it. Okay? Neglect and atrophy aren't the only ways our circuits can change. When we change our minds about something, we really change our minds. To change habitual behavior, there's something you want to change about yourself. The first thing that has to be done is you have to come to a decision that the benefits of the new behaviors outweigh the cost of continuing the old behaviors. In other words, I'm talking about a cost-benefit analysis. Let's see, what are the pros of continuing this behavior? What are the cons? What are the pros of that new behavior? What are the cons? We have to weigh those kinds of things in our mind and come to a decision. Because if we don't buy into it at the deepest level, nothing is going to change. No matter how hard you try, I don't care how many programs you try, okay, nothing is going to change. An example of that, I smoked for 40 years, okay, a couple of packs a day. In 1999, I was sitting on a hospital bed looking at my cardiologist, and she looked me in the eye and she said to me, if you continue smoking when you leave here, the chances of you having another heart attack are 4 times greater than if you do not. I had just had a major heart attack that damn near killed me. Okay. Still, in the car on the way home, I'm thinking, how can I get her to stop for a couple of packs of cigarettes or a carton? Because I'm dying here. They don't let you smoke in intensive care. They're very careful about that. And my wife looked at me and said, you start smoking again, I'm leaving, because I'm not going to stay here and watch you die. All right? All of a sudden, the cons of continuing that new behavior just shot through the roof. I haven't smoked since. You know, obviously, or she wouldn't be sitting here this morning, because I believed her. Okay. But I had tried everything over the years. The last 10 years, I tried almost everything. I tried hypnosis, patches, pills, you name it. I tried it. But I didn't want to quit. I hadn't made that decision. It wasn't bad enough. And it was the same thing with my major addiction. I had to come to that decision. So it's a very important thing. You first have to come to that decision by whatever means, okay? And then you have the motivation to do the work to change the behavior, because it's not easy. It's not easy. And I'm not standing here trying to say it is. It's hard work to change ingrown behavior. We act as we feel, and we feel as we think. Therefore, our thoughts drive our actions. We have to change, actually, the way we think and the way we believe, and what we believe about things. And there are a number of ways to do that. Cognitive behavioral therapy is one way that I happen to be rather familiar with. I'm just going to talk about this for a couple of minutes. Dr. Albert Ellis developed a psychotherapy in the 1950s called REBT, or Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy. And it's based on an ABCDE kind of method. A being an activating event, B being your belief about the event, C being the consequences of that belief, and D being the dispute of that belief. And an example might be, I'll just do one quick example, your boss yells at you, and I'm going to put this in an addiction context because that's where I understand it best. Your boss yells at you, and immediately your belief is, I'm a worthless person. I don't belong on the face of the earth. I'm a bad employee. Okay? I can't do this job or any other job. I'd be better off if I was dead. All right? The consequence of that belief, because of the stress levels and everything else involved, could be, in the case of an addict, a relapse. Okay, what does REBT suggest? REBT suggests disputing that irrational belief. Of course, you're not a worthless person. You may have done that particular thing inappropriately, but that doesn't make you a worthless person. You are, in fact, not a bad person at all. You've done this, that, and the other, so on and so forth. You dispute the belief. You do that often enough and sincerely enough. You change the belief so that perhaps that very same cue, that very same activating event happening a few months down the road causes a totally different reaction. It causes you to believe, well, maybe he's right. Maybe I should have done that a little better. Or, gee, maybe there's a possibility he misunderstood something, or whatever. And in any case, the belief becomes a rational belief rather than an irrational belief. And that's why you go through a process like that, to pay attention and ferret out your irrational beliefs that cause consequences that you don't particularly want, and change those irrational beliefs into rational beliefs. You pay attention and practice the new method until it becomes your new habit. Now, the old pathways don't necessarily turn around, wither, and die. They still could hang around, all right? I'm not saying those old behaviors couldn't come back if you let them. But what you've done is you've taken that habit, okay, out of the unconscious mind, and you've shone a light on it. You've moved it into the conscious arena, where now you can look at it and make a judgment, okay, which an addict who's using doesn't make judgments, okay. You buy liquor, or you buy whatever, you don't make judgments, you don't think about it. So we're trying to shine a light on it. And the last thing I want to talk about today is neurogenesis. I'm not afraid of dying. I damn near did. I'm not afraid of death. What I am afraid of, though, in fact, I wouldn't move it to the terror stage, but I'm more than nervous, is living the final stages of my life in a less than cognizant manner. I am afraid of dementia, Alzheimer's, the same concerns I'm sure a lot of you have. I don't want to end up a drooling idiot. Okay, I don't want to, especially if I have to know I am. So part of my, and I certainly don't want Gethin to have to take care of me either. So part of my research has been into, well, how can I personally avoid that? Well, there's no way to avoid it completely. I mean, what happens, happens, and we only have some control over it. But we do have some, and that's the important thing. We do grow new neurons. We do have the ability to stimulate not only neuron growth, but stimulate our brains. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can augment that process that goes on automatically anyway. First and foremost is exercise. The number one way to promote neuron growth, the growth of new neurons, is to exercise. A couple of 2-3 times a week. A study at Columbia University, a rather large study, indicated that people who exercise 2 or 3 times a week had 2 to 3 times the growth of new neurons as compared with the control group who did not. 2 to 3 times the growth of new neurons. This sounds facetious, but it isn't. Blueberries have a dye, if I can pronounce this right, anthocyanin is the dye in blueberries that makes them blue. That dye has the ability to penetrate the blood-brain barrier, and it goes to the dentate gyrus, which is part of the hippocampus, and stimulates the growth of new neurons. So these guys outside, they're doing you a favor. Okay? Blueberries are a way to stimulate neuron growth. Meditation. There's a major study done at Yale, Harvard, and MIT. People who meditate, and they used for the meditation group Buddhist monks, okay, doing straight Buddhist meditation, focusing on breath, that kind of meditation, had a marked increase in the thickness of their brain structure dealing with attention, sensory input, and memory. Attention, sensory input, and memory. Meditation's a pretty easy thing to do. I mean, I wandered off and did 15 minutes this morning. Part of it was to calm me down, and the other part was, you guys did great though, thanks. The other part was to, because I do that, okay? It's an easy thing to do. It doesn't require any money, doesn't require, anything other than your attention. Living in an enriched environment, a mentally stimulating environment enhances neurogenesis. And lastly, the actual act of learning is key not only to stimulate neuron growth, but also to put the new neurons to work, which is key. Doesn't do any good to grow them when you're pruning 20 billion a day, okay, if you're not going to put them to work. Learning a new language, it turns out, is one of the best ways to not only stimulate neuron growth, but put them to work. Try to learn something new and challenge yourself. Keep learning. That's the best way that science knows to maintain your mental acuity. You guys have been great. I thank you very much for your attention. Anybody has any questions?
Thank you so much.
Pete, don't go away. There may be questions for you.
I would like to say I have learned so much in 45 minutes, and perhaps my whole life. I took copious notes, and I thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm very impressed with how do we change our behavior. I would not speak of this if I did not know that there are many people who have experienced what I have experienced. I moved down here 2.5 years ago, and as a result of that, I lost my family. Now, you had an addiction for 40 years. I had a love for 40 years, and now it is gone. But what I am doing is exactly what you have told me to do. I must accept that change, and I must put it away and have new behavior. And you spoke of how difficult it is, but that is what I must do, and the cost and benefit. And I think there are many people, I have spoken to many, who have experienced the same thing. So thank you so much for bringing that up.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you. You may have seen the article in the Wall Street Journal, February 12th, the breakthrough, as they call it in perhaps Alzheimer's. Now, of course, every once in a while you see these suggestions that there's some medication that may help. This product has been tested by a number of the institutes, and it turns out that Bexadrine, which is medication for skin cancer, in rabbits and mice, rids them of the buildup of gamma, beta, and this is what they feel is one of the factors in our brain shutting down eventually. So consequently, here's the point. Bexadrine is supposed to be going offline. Their patent is almost finished. Doctors can make prescriptions for other purposes if they deem it's helpful. They have to be careful being sued, of course. But I understand, I've read the recent material, and people are flooding in the United States to get offline prescriptions for Bexadrine in tablet form.
Is there a question? Pete, does anyone have a question?
I have one. You mentioned dopamine in your talk. I don't quite understand. Dopamine, as I understand it, is a chemical medicine of some type that they give to dementia and Alzheimer's patients.
L-DOPA.
L-DOPA?
Yeah, that's what L-DOPA does is essentially, well, it does some things chemically. Again, I'm not a neurologist or anything close to it, but L-DOPA is used not only for Alzheimer's, but it's used for Parkinson's for quite a long period of time, and it enhances the production of dopamine, is what it does.
And dopamine does what? Causes tranquility in the patient?
No, actually, the opposite effect usually. But the brain is a very complicated place, and I can't,
Question?
Just
Before,
wait for
Would
the
you
mic.
wait
The
for
mic's
the
on the way to
microphone,
you.
please?
I don't need the microphone.
Thank you.
Before the talk,
Please use the mic.
Before, we were talking about a book that you mentioned in the library. Would you please name that again, about brain chemistry?
Oh,
I think it was Schwartz, I'm not sure.
yeah.
Thank you.
I didn't know if this would get into the talk or not. If anyone is interested in continuing to learn about what I talked about today, neuroplasticity and how it's being used in different areas by real scientists, there's a book in the library at LCS here called The Mind and the Brain by Schwartz. He's one of the co-authors, and much of what I talked about this morning, Jeffrey Schwartz, much of what I talked about this morning is in there in some form or other.
Thank you.
The Mind,
The Mind
and the Brain, Jeffrey Schwartz.
There's a question. There's a question over here in front of the gazebo, please.
Thank you for such a well-organized, clear presentation. I wanted to share something. I've been in 2 neuroplasticity studies in the States by very prestigious Mass General and Yale. Been imaged many times due to a physical illness. But the finding was that neuroplasticity varies from person to person, your own capacity. But I wanted just to share a website for everybody if you wanted to take a peek of how to work your neurons called lumosity.com. LUMOSITY. 8 million, this is a study of 8 million people in the States and how to improve, if you want, neuroplasticity. And it focuses on 4 areas: attention, speed of processing, problem solving, memory, and attention. And the first month is free, so you may want to just take a look at it. I mean, I started at the bottom in the cellar. I'd be embarrassed to tell my score. But you can see your improvement very quickly in those areas. You do have to, it's like exercise for the mind. It's not a fun, just change your mind about something. So that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Pete Soderman, for your wonderful presentation. Next week, we will welcome Christopher English, who will talk about finding our balance through synchronicity. Please remember to turn your cell phones back on and to pick up your coffee cups and stack the chairs by color and style. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you next Sunday.